A cargo ship in the Caspian Sea, a Ukrainian drone, and one sailor who never made it home. Well, most of the world barely noticed. But, according to a senior advisor to Iran's supreme leader, that single strike put 3 locations inside Ukraine on Iran's target list and brought Tehran to the edge of entering Europe's largest war since 1945. His name is Mohsen Rezaei, former commander of the Revolutionary Guards. And on August the 3rd, on Iranian state television, he claimed that the strikes were prepared and then called off because of what he describes as an apology from Kyiv. Now, Iran has released no evidence of how close these strikes actually came. This remains an Iranian claim, but the fact that such a senior figure chose to announce it publicly is remarkable on its own. Because think about what it would have meant. Iran, already under enormous military pressure in the Middle East, considering opening a new front against a country armed and backed by virtually the entire Western security establishment. Why? What could Ukraine possibly have done? Well, the answer takes us somewhere most people would never expect this war to reach: the Caspian Sea. A drone operation, a disputed ship, a dead sailor, and a phone call that may have stopped a second war before it started. But once we reconstruct exactly what happened, the story becomes far more complicated than Iran simply threatening Ukraine. So let's get started. On July the 25th, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky announced what he described as very strong results from Ukrainian long-range operations in the Caspian Sea. He specifically referred to strikes involving a Russian warship and vessels allegedly being used to transport military cargo connected with Iran. Now, that alone was significant. For most people following the Russia-Ukraine war, the geography is pretty familiar. Kyiv, Donbass, Crimea, the Black Sea, Russian refineries, Russian airfields. But occasionally targets deep inside Russian territory. And then the Caspian. The Caspian Sea feels different. It's an enormous inland sea bordered by Russia, Iran, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan. And for Moscow and Tehran, it has strategic value precisely because it connects 2 countries whose military relationship has become increasingly important. Ukraine has spent years trying to destroy not only Russian troops on the battlefield, but also the networks that allow Russia to keep fighting. Things like the fuel infrastructure, airfields, weapons factories, military depots, ships, transport routes, and increasingly the logistics systems far beyond the conventional front line. So when Zelensky talked about vessels in the Caspian Sea carrying military cargo involving Iran, Ukraine was effectively presenting the operation as another attack on the infrastructure supporting Russia's war. The Tehran government summoned Ukraine's diplomatic representative and condemned the incident as an act of aggression. Iran also accused Ukraine of dangerously expanding the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And here is where the first major uncertainty enters the story. Ukraine publicly acknowledged successful strikes against vessels it associated with Iranian military cargo. But Zelensky did not specifically identify the Iranian vessel that Tehran says was attacked. Now that distinction matters, it really matters, because Iran says Ukraine attacked a commercial Iranian ship. Ukraine says its operation targeted vessels being used in military logistics connected with Iran. Now, those claims overlap, but they're not identical. And from this point forward, each government began telling the story through its own understanding of the war. Now, from Iran's perspective, one of its ships had been attacked and one of its citizens had been killed. From Ukraine's perspective, Iran cannot separate itself so easily from the war. The reason is the Shahed drone. Since Russia's full-scale invasion, Iranian-designed Shahed attack drones have become one of the defining weapons of Russia's long-range campaign against Ukraine. Now, Moscow later expanded domestic production and adapted the technology, but the Iranian origin of the system and the earlier military cooperation between Tehran and Moscow are well established. For Ukrainians, these are not just some sort of abstract weapon. They've actually heard them flying over the cities. They buzz over their heads. It's very hard for them to miss. They've watched air defences trying to intercept them. They've seen them used in attacks throughout the war, and that has shaped Kyiv's view of Tehran. So Ukraine effectively sees Iran as an indirect participant because of that military relationship with Russia. And that also explains why Ukraine's first public response to Iranian anger was anything but apologetic. And Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha called Iran's accusations, quote, unjustified and groundless. And he accused Tehran of being a direct accomplice in Russian aggression by providing Moscow with weapons. And then he made Kyiv's position even clearer. In Ukraine's view, Iran could not support the Russian war effort and then act as though it were completely removed from the consequences of that war. Well, that was the message. And Tehran had already warned that the attack could not go unanswered. Now, at this stage, there appeared to be very little room for compromise. Iran had a dead sailor. Ukraine was openly accusing Iran of helping Russia kill Ukrainians. Tehran was threatening consequences. Kyiv was rejecting Iran's moral argument. And then something changed. A phone call happened. On July the 28th, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha spoke with Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. Ukraine's position was that its military activities were aimed at defending the country against Russian aggression, and that Ukrainian forces had not intended to target civilians or indeed civilian vessels. Kyiv also made clear that it did not want further escalation with Iran. And Araghchi said Sybiha had assured him the strike was unintentional. Iran said it did not want escalation either, although Tehran continued demanding compensation for the losses caused by the incident. But this is where the word apology becomes really important. Several reports describing Iran's later position say Tehran believes Kyiv apologised. Mohsen Rezaei subsequently said Ukraine called the incident a mistake. But Ukraine's publicly reported language is more carefully constructed. Kyiv said it had no intention of striking civilians. Now, that distinction is important because it allowed both governments to save face. Face, of course, being the essential thing for both sides. Ukraine could maintain that its campaign against Russian-linked military logistics remained legitimate, and Iran could tell its own public that Ukraine had backed down and acknowledged a mistake. And suddenly, both governments had that escape route. Then Rezaei revealed what Iran says almost happened behind the scenes. On August the 3rd, Mohsen Rezaei appeared on Iranian state television and made the claim that transformed this from a maritime dispute into a huge international headline. Iran, he said, had been ready to strike 3 locations inside Ukraine. And according to Rezaei, those attacks were being considered in retaliation for the incident involving that Iranian vessel. Then he said Ukraine communicated that what happened had been a mistake and Iran reconsidered. The strikes weren't then carried out. Now, Rezaei did not publicly identify the 3 alleged targets. Now, we don't know whether they were military bases, government facilities, weapons factories or intelligence sites, or actually something else entirely. And nor has Iran publicly provided evidence demonstrating exactly how advanced the attack preparations were. But the fact that a senior Iranian figure chose to publicly announce the claim is itself pretty damn important. Because governments don't communicate military threats only to describe the past. They also communicate them to shape the future. Iran is effectively sending Ukraine a message. We considered retaliating directly. We chose not to this time, but don't assume the same thing will happen again. And that may be more important than whether Iranian missiles were literally sitting on launchers waiting for that final authorization. Because it's all about deterrence. Deterrence operates partly through perception. And Tehran wants Kyiv to believe that another strike on Iranian interests could produce a direct Iranian response. Now, Ukraine, meanwhile, has to decide whether that threat was actually credible. And that decision is becoming increasingly complicated, as these things tend to be. And this is where the story moves from politics into military geography. Iran possesses long-range missiles and drones, we know that, but striking Ukraine from Iranian territory is not quite as simple as just drawing a straight line across the map. Any weapon launched towards Ukraine would have to cross or navigate around the territory and airspace of other countries. The precise route would depend on the weapon, the target, and of course the launch point. And that is what creates diplomatic and military complications. A direct Iranian strike on Ukraine would also represent a pretty dramatic escalation in Tehran's involvement. Now, until now, Iran's role in the Ukraine war has largely been discussed through its military relationship with Russia, and of course particularly drone technology and weapons cooperation. Iran launching its own attack directly against Ukrainian territory would then cross another threshold. Ukraine could then argue that Iran was no longer merely supporting Russia. Iran itself would have directly attacked Ukraine. And that, obviously, could create difficult questions for European governments. It could intensify Ukrainian operations against Iranian-linked assets. It could increase intelligence and military cooperation between Ukraine and Iran's adversaries. And it could turn a very complicated indirect confrontation into something much harder to control. And this is one reason Iran may have had a strong incentive to accept Ukraine's de-escalatory language. But Kyiv had equally strong reasons to provide it. Ukraine's already fighting one enormous war. So opening a separate direct military confrontation with Iran would create another strategic problem at the worst possible time. Now, that doesn't mean Kyiv suddenly views Tehran as neutral. It means there's a difference between attacking a logistics network that you believe supports Russia and deliberately entering a new state-to-state war. And this may be the real logic behind the phone call. Neither side changed its fundamental position. They simply found a smaller question that they could agree on. And Iran says its civilian vessel was attacked. Ukraine says civilians were not intentionally targeted. Iran says Ukraine acknowledged the incident was unintentional. Ukraine says it doesn't want escalation. And that was apparently enough, for now. But there's another part of this story that deserves a little bit more attention, and this is, of course, the Caspian Sea itself. For years, Russia has been able to treat enormous areas far from Ukraine's conventional front lines as relatively protected spaces. Ukraine has been systematically attacking that assumption. Long-range drones have changed the whole geography of the war now, because they allow Kyiv to threaten targets far beyond what many people would traditionally think of as the battlefield. And the Caspian is particularly interesting because of its relationship to Russia's southern logistics and its connection with, of course, with Iran. Now, Russia itself has previously used naval forces in the Caspian to project its military power towards Ukraine. But now Ukraine is demonstrating that the Caspian isn't necessarily beyond its reach either. So that creates a new calculation for every ship operating in that region. Things like who owns the vessel, what flag does it fly, what cargo is it carrying, where is that cargo going, is it civilian, is it dual use, is it sanctioned, is it supporting the Russian military? And crucially, what happens if intelligence is wrong? Because long-range warfare creates a very dangerous paradox. The further Ukraine becomes capable of striking, the more Russian military infrastructure becomes vulnerable. But the further Ukrainian operations travel from the conventional battlefield, the greater the possibility of interacting with third countries. And Iran is the clearest example. A strike designed to disrupt Russian military logistics can suddenly become a diplomatic crisis with Tehran. One dead sailor can change the entire character of the whole incident. And one misunderstanding can create pressure for retaliation. And that's why this story is much bigger than just one ship. It's really about how the boundaries separating different conflicts are now becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. And look at the larger picture. Russia and Iran have developed increasingly important strategic and military ties. Iranian-designed drones have become part of Russia's arsenal against Ukraine. So Ukraine has therefore developed a direct interest in disrupting systems connecting Tehran and Moscow. And at the same time, Iran is dealing with its own military confrontation and, of course, enormous pressure in the Middle East. That means decisions being made in one war can increasingly produce consequences in another. And the Caspian strike demonstrates exactly how this happens. Ukraine doesn't need to formally declare war on Iran. Iran doesn't need to formally join Russia's invasion. But instead, the connection develops step by step. Iranian technology reaches Russia. Russian forces use that technology against Ukraine. Ukraine begins targeting supply networks associated with Iran. An Iranian vessel is hit. An Iranian sailor dies. Iran threatens retaliation. Ukraine warns Iran not to escalate. Iran claims it prepares targets inside Ukraine. Diplomats intervene. The attack allegedly gets cancelled. Now, at every individual stage, leaders can say they don't want a wider war, but collectively, those stages create exactly the conditions in which wider wars can then emerge. Not because somebody wakes up one morning and suddenly decides to start World War III, but because countries make one decision after another while believing each individual decision is manageable in and of itself. Then eventually, one side miscalculates, and the other side feels it has no choice but to respond. And that is the hidden danger inside this story. So, who backed down? And this is probably the question that many viewers will ask. Did Ukraine back down? Did Iran back down? Well, the answer depends heavily on which capital that you listen to. Iran can present the outcome as proof of deterrence. Its version is pretty straightforward. An Iranian vessel was attacked, Iran prepared retaliation, Ukraine recognised its mistake, Iran then showed restraint and cancelled the strikes. So that narrative makes Tehran look powerful but controlled. But Ukraine can tell almost the opposite story. Kyiv can say it successfully attacked Russian-linked military logistics in the Caspian. It rejected Iranian accusations. It reminded Tehran that Iranian weapons have helped Russia fight Ukraine. Then, of course, it clarified that civilians were never deliberately targeted and avoided an unnecessary second confrontation. But that narrative makes Ukraine look firm but pragmatic. And then there's a third interpretation. Perhaps neither side really backed down. Perhaps both governments simply realised that escalating this particular incident would cost more than either side would then gain. Iran doesn't need another direct enemy. Ukraine doesn't need another war. So the diplomats then found language vague enough that both governments could then interpret it differently. And that's not unusual in international diplomacy. In fact, sometimes ambiguity is exactly what prevents escalation. If Ukraine had been forced to publicly confess wrongdoing, Kyiv might have refused. If Iran had been forced to publicly admit its threats were empty, Tehran might have escalated simply to preserve credibility, to save face. But instead, each side received something. Ukraine maintained its larger political position. Iran received what it interprets as acknowledgement that the civilian casualties were unintended. And the missiles, if Rezaei's account of the preparations is accurate, remained unused. So the immediate crisis may have cooled, but the underlying conflict has most definitely not. Iran is still demanding compensation. And Tehran has also indicated it wants to see practical evidence supporting Ukraine's position that the incident was indeed unintentional. Ukraine has shown no indication that it suddenly considers Iranian support for Russia acceptable. And Ukraine's long-range strike capabilities are not going anywhere. They're certainly not disappearing. And that means the next incident could be much harder to contain. Imagine another Iranian-linked vessels hit, or another Iranian citizens killed. The first time, Tehran can say it accepted Ukraine's explanation. The second time, well, explaining it as an accident becomes politically a little bit more difficult. And at the same time, if Iran responded directly against Ukrainian territory, Kyiv's incentives would change completely. Ukraine might begin viewing Iranian infrastructure not simply as part of Russia's supply network, but as infrastructure belonging to a country that had directly attacked Ukraine. Now that is that escalation ladder that both governments currently appear to be trying not to climb. And this is why the most important part of the story may not be the strike itself that happened. It may be the strike that didn't. Now this time the escalation stopped before another weapon was launched. But the real story is whether the world will be as lucky next time. So what do you think? Did Iran genuinely come close to striking Ukraine, or was this mainly a warning meant to stop Kyiv from targeting Iranian interests again? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to watch more videos on major geopolitical events and global power shifts and the trends reshaping the world around us, do subscribe to the channel and don't forget to turn on those notifications, because we bring you stories that don't just change governments and borders, they can ultimately impact the lives of all of us. See you next time.